going to look at, in this section, at some of the more commonly used Continental maintenance tools. I've laid out the ones that, that we use most frequently. Some of these tools are factory Continental tools, and they're still available on the surplus market. Some of these tools were things that we made in an attempt to make life easier, and a couple of them are beautiful little tools that everybody needs to have in their toolbox. So I'd like to go through these and just talk about them for a second. This is the intake pipe gland nut wrench. It has a loop on the end of it, which is designed to have a bar go through it to remove and reinstall the intake gland nut. Both of these little wrenches are pushrod tube gland nut wrenches. One tightens down the retainer, the other the nut. And this is the original cylinder base nut wrench. It was a beautiful wrench, fits very, very well, does a great job. Unfortunately, these critters are getting kind of scarce because of the high torque that is put on a Continental cylinder base, 400 inch-pounds versus 250 to 300 inch-pounds for most of the other manufacturers. And because this wrench is so thin in this area, these wrenches have a tendency to crack. So in production, we go through one of these wrenches about every 4 or 5 engine overhauls. And so they've gotten used up over the years. This one also has a loop on the end, and brings up an interesting question. If there is a specific torque value in the overhaul manual for a cylinder base nut, which is 400 inch-pounds, how can you expect someone to accurately do that with a loop and a bar on the other end? What is 400 inch-pounds to my elbow may not be 400 inch-pounds to your elbow. And so the only way that we can do this accurately is if we modify this wrench. And so if you have an original W670 Continental cylinder base nut wrench, it's a good idea to modify it. I have one of the modified ones over here, and basically what we did was just cut the wrench off, bought a cheap half-inch drive socket and welded that socket on. Now we're welding to a wrench and we're welding to a socket, and that's not really good practice if you were expecting something to retain its strength in that area. But because it really doesn't put that much load on it for us to put 400 inch-pounds on here, these things last forever. And so though it's not good practice to weld to sockets and wrenches, doing this works out just fine. This is the replacement cylinder base nut wrench. It's a beautiful little wrench that's made by Snap-on, and it works well. It's not as good a wrench as these originals were, but on the other hand, it doesn't break as frequently either. So, and it's set up for 3/8 drive on this end, so you can use a torque wrench on it. But these are available. This is the valve adjust lock nut wrench, and so whenever you do your valve adjustment, you will need this to lock down the lock nut. This is not a Continental tool at all. This is a Jacobs tool. This is a Jacobs valve adjust screwdriver, but it works very well on a Continental. And though you don't absolutely have to have this, you can get by with a different tool or with a large screwdriver. This works very well. The same as goes for this lock nut wrench. You can probably use a different tool. You can find something to substitute for these and get away with it. Now with some of these other tools you really can't. You can't substitute anything else for the gland nut wrench. You can't substitute anything else for the cylinder base nut wrench. But some of these tools, if you don't have an original, you can find something else to work. This is a thrust nut wrench, and because there are two different styles of thrust nuts used on the Continental, we have both of those patterns on this thrust nut wrench. So if you have the flange style wrench, you use this side. If you have the one without the flange, then you use this side. And you'll wind up having to put a cheater bar on here to get the proper torque. But that is available. We manufacture those. This is the crankshaft pinch bolt wrench, which unless you get into the inside of your engine, you'll never need one of these. But if you do work on the inside of your engine and have to stretch the crankshaft pinch bolt, this is the wrench that you'll use to do that. This is a valve spring compressor, and these are still available as well. This is an elegant little tool. And if you wind up having to lap a valve because you've got a leaking exhaust valve or leaking intake valve, you'll need the valve spring compressor in order to remove and reinstall the valve springs and the valve. Now we get into the homemade tools. If you've ever had to replace the carburetor on a W670 engine, especially on the airplane, you'll know that there is one nut that is almost impossible to get to on that carburetor. This is our answer to that. This is a handy-dandy little T-wrench, and we'll look at this thing in a little more detail in a few minutes. But this thing will not make the job easy, but it will make the job possible. So you can get back in there on that nut, and you can move it ever so slightly and remove and install the carburetor. This is another homemade wrench, another T-handle wrench that we've made that is for tightening and loosening the Palnuts on the cylinder base nuts. This is, again, not absolutely necessary. It's possible to get in and do the job with an open-end wrench, but this makes life so much easier to be able to tighten and loosen your Palnuts. Now this wrench has been ground on severely in this area so that it will reach into all the areas on the cylinder bases. This is a crankshaft turning bar, which again is a tool that we manufacture, but is very nice if you have the propeller off and you want to turn the crankshaft, or if you're retightening the thrust nut, you'll need to be able to hold the crankshaft in some manner, and this does it. It has the blind spline machined into it for the blind spline on the crankshaft, and a really worthwhile little tool. Now this is probably the neatest tool of all, and we're gonna look at this one a little closer too. This is a Palnut installation tool, and with this thing you can get to some of those back cylinder base stud locations where you can't even see them. You strictly have to do it by feel, but you can load a Palnut onto this little tool. You can get back there where you can only feel and can't see, and you can start your Palnuts. So let's look at this one and that carburetor wrench a little closer. All right, this is our carburetor tool, and as you can see, it is strictly just a T-handle that has been welded, or actually brazed in this case, to a clevis, which then has a very short section, about 1.25 inches long, of a 1/2-inch wrench. This was just a Craftsman 1/2-inch wrench. We cut it off so that it was about 1.25 inches long, drilled a hole through it, and it allows us to get that carburetor on and off in a way that I'm not sure exactly how you do it without a tool like this. Very simple tool to make, but a very essential one if you ever have to pull a carburetor off. Our second little tool is that Palnut installation tool. If you can see this, what this little head is a female version of the Palnut. So the Palnut slips on there, and then it's neuralized on the outside, so that you can, just by touching the outside rim, you can install that Palnut. And then it's been riveted to a piece of hacksaw blade. The hacksaw blade is very flexible, allows us to get in there in places, put some pressure against the stud so that we can tighten that, that Palnut down. And then this wrench, this is our Palnut removal and installation tool, and this is just a section of 9/16 Craftsman wrench that was cut off and again brazed. The only issue with brazing and welding on these things is that you don't want to get a lot of heat down near the head of the wrenches, because that will take all the temper out of the wrench and cause it to fail pretty quickly.